Thank you all for being here tonight. Like, I really appreciate the turnout. I was worried that people weren't going to come out because it was going to be a cold night. So, and also a Sunday night rather than a Saturday night. So thank you all for being here. Callie and Leah's talk was pretty funny. Like that is a tough act to follow. So honestly, if you guys really want to be entertained, just go home right now. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about is maybe not as funny as which plants match your yard. I'm going to be talking about the forest. I'm going to be talking about the forest that once was here. So I want you to take a moment to imagine where you're sitting right now. What did this land look like 300 years ago, 400 years ago, maybe pre-Columbian, before white people showed up? Imagine 600, 800, 1,000 years ago. What did this land look like? Like, somebody tell me, what did this look like right here? This was a forest. This was a forest. This was a forest probably with larger trees than most trees that you usually see today. This was a whole forest with trees, big trees. So there are vestiges of that still. It's not entirely gone, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Here's a poem for you. Shadows of the old forest, fallen concrete. All that remains are the dreams of the forest to be. So with that, I want to begin with a story from the past. And this is a story for people who are native to Ohio, may be familiar with. Now, I'm not from here. I came here from Wisconsin. You might tell from my accent, actually. The key is once you have more than 2 beers, the accent comes out. Just putting that out there. So anyway, the Logan elm is a famous tree around here. It's not in the city of Columbus, which is what this talk was promised to be about, but it's a tree very close to Columbus. So I want to begin with this. 1774, upon the signing of a peace treaty enabling white colonization of this whole region of what was to become the United States, Chief Logan speaks of the betrayal and murder of his family, his wife, his brother, his sister, and his nephew at the Yellow Creek Massacre, which triggered a war between the Virginia militia, Virginia was still a British colony at the time, and the Shawnee, Mingo, Ottawa, and Delaware nations. They were defeated, and they were forced to cede what later became West Virginia and Kentucky to white settlers. This was his speech. His speech was underneath an elm tree south of what is now Circleville, Ohio. And the tree remains. So the years passed and the tree grew. The tree was a big tree in the 1700s at the time of that peace treaty. By 1899, you can see, I don't know how well people in the back can see this. Here are some people here standing next to this elm tree. So this tree is probably about 20 feet in girth at this point. So by 1912, they erect a monument to this tree and what had happened in the past there. You can see the tree in the background and all the people for scale. Next. Put the monument up in 1919. So the tree grows through the years. I'm wondering, who has heard of this story? You guys, show me your hands. Who has heard this story before? No one? Really? Okay. All right, so 1912, here's the Logan elm. 1932, by this point, the tree has grown to nearly 24 feet in girth, and the branches spread 180 feet. So if this tree was growing here, if it was about halfway between me and very conveniently, that is an elm tree way in the back there, its limbs would probably spread both covering me as well as covering there. This was an immense tree. But things don't last forever. So in 1941, the poet laureate of Ohio wrote a poem for this tree. And the screen's a little wrinkled, so I'll read the poem. "O ancient elm, where Logan stood beneath the kindly shade, he little dreamed his eloquence for him a shrine had made. Though many moons have waxed and waned since he his story told, the great tree flourishes as green as in the days of old." But things don't last forever. So in this photo, we can see the tree has lost one of its top limbs. I don't know the date of this photo, unfortunately. Click again, Julie. So Dutch elm disease arrives in the United States. So this came in on wood imported from the Netherlands, hence it's called Dutch elm disease, even though the fungus that is actually the pathogen is thought to have originated in Asia. But it's transmitted by a pair of bark beetles, one native species, one an exotic species. So foreshadowing here, the Dutch elm disease arrives, reaches Ohio in 1930, dies out, spreads again across the entire United States in the mid-20th century, killing millions of American elms in cities, fields, and forests. Click for me, Julie. And so, of course, the old tree dies. So the Logan elm, dying of Dutch elm disease, is further damaged by a storm, and it's cut down in 1964. The stone monuments are all that remain. This is a little small for everybody to see, but here are some people from a high school yearbook. Here are 4 high school seniors perched on the tree for scale here. So unfortunately, the trunk of the tree is even gone. All that remains are the stone monuments. But this thing's about 5 miles south of Circleville, if anybody's traveling south on 23. So anyway, I wanted to mention Dutch elm disease. I'd be remiss if I'm talking about trees in the city to not talk about elm trees, to not begin the talk about elm trees, and to not talk about why there are not elm trees anymore, or at least not as many as there used to be. If we were talking a talk about the forest, I would be speaking of chestnuts, and I would be talking about the chestnut blight that killed chestnut trees across the entire United States, eastern United States, between 1904, when the chestnut blight originated in New York City, to the mid-20th century, at which point the chestnut blight had killed chestnuts all the way from Maine, basically to like Kentucky and Tennessee. So all the chestnuts in Ohio were already gone at the time that Dutch elm disease came through. But then Dutch elm disease comes, and elms, unlike chestnut, elms were like the preeminent tree that were planted in cities. People planted them along streets. There were almost green cathedrals of elms over streets that had these trees planted along them. And so this was the end of elm trees, though. So there are these, a native and a European elm bark beetle that transmitted an exotic fungus from Asia, and the disease spread. It actually originated in Ohio in 1930 on, I mentioned this before, I'm maybe at 2 beers in, so you guys gotta forgive me if I repeat myself. On wood brought over for the furniture trade here. The disease spread a little bit, died out, reappeared in New York City and spread from there across the entire eastern US. So 1934, 1938, 1950 to Michigan, 1956 to Wisconsin, and then from there across. So anyway, the bark beetles left these kind of patterns on the wood here. I realize this is actually probably a little hard for you guys to see, but basically these little beetles bore into the wood, they spread the fungus, and that's the end of the trees. So Julie, click for me, thanks. So this is still spreading. Because this is spread by insects, this disease sometimes takes a while to go find the trees to kill. So this is recent. So it's still killing historic elms, but that means there are still historic elms out there. So this is at John Brown's house, the famous abolitionist in Providence, Rhode Island. So died and was cut down from Dutch elm disease March 31st, 2015. So I mentioned before that I've had enough beers that you guys can tell I'm from Wisconsin. So, so both for the number of beers had and also for perhaps a bit of a Wisconsin or northern accent. So anyway, so this is the University of Wisconsin campus. Now we're going to get to Ohio State. Don't worry, that's later in the talk. But I wanted to start out with Wisconsin here. So University of Wisconsin, this is the equivalent of the main quad, the equivalent of the oval. This is Bascom Hill. And so at the time of the founding of the University of Wisconsin, 1848, in the next 2 or 3 years, they planted 700 elm trees across the entire campus. And so this is what it looked like by the mid-20th century. So there are these huge elm trees all through campus, century-old trees at that point. And they performed almost a green cathedral of shade across the entire city. But we know how this story goes. So Here's, you can see this is probably 1950s, early 1960s. This is before the stoners. This is before the hippies. This is like early 1960s. Here's one of the elms cut down from Dutch elm disease. And click again, Julie. And then we go a decade later, and now State Street, which doesn't mean anything to people here in Columbus, but in Madison, yeah, Leah's giving me yeah, State Street, right? Yeah, State Street. So the last elm of State Street cut down 1974. By 2004, only 16 of the Bascom elms remained. Now, by 2016, 3 remained. So in my time at Wisconsin as an undergrad was kind of the last of the elms. By the time after I was gone, only 3 remained. And this was one of them. So you can see it's now dwarfed by the campus here. Here's the old observatory. There used to be a great oak right here, which is gone. And here's one of the elms. And this one was affectionately named Elmer. I don't know why the need for corny jokes, but this was Elmer the elm. This is the biochemistry buildings here all around it. Click for me again. And so, again, we know how the story goes. So this would have been the way it looked when I was a student there. And then in a couple years later, Elmer first gets Dutch elm disease, and they try to cut as many of the limbs off of Elmer as they can. The color is a little faded here, but basically these are branches of leaves that are wilting and turning reddish brown, wilting in midsummer. And so it's only got 2 limbs left, and they're dying. And so the tree was cut down finally a month after this. But basically, this was the end of one of the last 3 elms in Wisconsin. So those are the ones that have died of disease. Perhaps this is a disease that we brought in carelessly, bringing in wood for the furniture trade. But still, it was an accident. What about the trees cut down intentionally? So this is the great treaty elm. This is also a Wisconsin tree. I had to sprinkle in some Wisconsin trees here. This was on the northern shore of Lake Winnebago, right where the Fox River flows out from Lake Winnebago toward Green Bay. So this was the Neenah treaty elm, or the council elm. And this tree was cut down a long time ago. Julie, if you click for me. This was the site of council meetings by Native Americans. So this was a living link to the past. This tree was cut down in 1890 to make more room for a shipping channel from Appleton on Lake Winnebago to Green Bay for the lumber trade. So there are the trees we lose through accident or disease, or natural deaths like storms. And then there's the trees that we just cut down out of carelessness. At the time, they probably had no idea that there wouldn't be an elm of this size in the entire United States 50 years later from disease. So anyway, what that brings me to is I had to get a quote in here somewhere. So Treebeard here, Lord of the Rings. Many of these trees were my friends, creatures I had known from nut and acorn. Many had voices of their own that are lost forever now. And there was a waste of stump and bramble where once there were singing groves. We've lost a link to the past here. But some remain. Obligatory Treebeard and Groot. Some of you may have noticed that I realized, I was like, this talk, in contrast to Callie and Leah's, which is super funny, I was like, this talk is not going to be funny. This talk's going to be a bit of a downer, actually. We got that guy there, too. This talk's going to be a bit of a downer. So I was like, I need to put in obligatory, like, a Groot and Treebeard photograph, lighten it up a bit. So, all right, that was inserted like half an hour before the presentation. So, so anyway, what is now field and city, like the grass we stand on here, only 2 centuries ago, within the lifespan of the elm trees that I've talked about, within the lifespan of many oaks, sycamores, ash, maple, there were trees that are still here from when this once was forest, when this was land that belonged to the Native Americans, before it was turned into, whatever. Now, I love that that's a brewery, but still, before it was turned into whatever. So these are their stories that I'm telling tonight. And these are our stories as well, because this is our history. So The forest here has changed. This, by the way, this graph is courtesy of my good friend Don Radcliffe, friend of some of us here tonight as well. He's now in University of Washington. But anyway, this doesn't come out too well on the screen here, but this is where the data's from. We have to have one data slide in here, otherwise it's not legit. Any more than one data slide, we need to get rid of all the extra data because it's going to make the talk boring. So I promise this is the only data slide. Basically, it didn't come out too well. Oaks, particularly white oaks, used to be a lot more abundant, that's the blue bars, than they are now, which is the orange bars. So the former forest composition, and this was assessed in basically what was called the Congress lands. This was land that was given by Congress to veterans of the Revolutionary War as part of the early white settlement of this area. By the way, enabled by that very peace treaty that I mentioned earlier, where Chief Logan was forced to basically sign for peace after being defeated, and there's an elm tree remembered for him. So this very area that's now settled used to have a lot of oak, and more oak than it does today. But some of those oaks remain. So anyway, next slide, Julie. So some of the pre-settlement oaks are still here in Ohio, both in the countryside and in cities. So this is a particularly big one. Has anyone heard of this tree? So I'm trying again. Nobody had heard of the Logan elm, because the Logan elm is gone from 1964. Has anyone heard of the Logan oak? It's more Logan. Has anyone heard of the Logan oak? All right, we got Dave. Dave's heard of the Logan oak. Good. I got one person who's heard of the Logan oak. I know Laura has also, but she didn't raise her hand. So this tree is in Logan, Ohio. It's not named for Chief Logan. It's named for the city that it's in. It's claimed to be 600 years old. I doubt that it's actually quite that old, but it's several hundred years old. It precedes colonization of this land. Click next, Julie. It's being propagated from acorns now. They're trying to do a reforestation program. I think this is pretty cool. But what I want everybody to notice is this tree originally was forest grown. It's got a tall, straight trunk. It now has many broad spreading limbs that indicate an open grown tree. Basically, oaks, when in full sun, they spread their limbs wide. I have to hold one hand for the microphone. Here we go. They spread their limbs wide. In the forest, they don't. Okay, so if you see a white oak tree that is a tall, straight trunk, that indicates that it grew in a forest when it was young. These wide-spreading limbs indicate that it's been in the open area for a long time. So this tree is in a cemetery, an old cemetery, and it's been in a cemetery at this point probably for a good 180 years or so. But vestige of it as once being a forest tree remains. So click next for me. Here's another one. There's just going to be a bunch of tree pictures here. So if you hate trees, you can go home now. Some of these involve people we know. Here is actually my lovely wife as a sense of scale here. So this tree is 24 feet in girth. That means that it would take 4 people, if you were my height, if you were 6 feet tall, it would take 4 people reaching around the tree to get your arms around the tree. This is 8 feet across at the base. This is, I believe, the state champion chinkapin oak, somewhere near Lancaster, Ohio, southeast of here a little bit. Here's another one. So again, the same species, chinkapin oak, Quercus muhlenbergii. Now, here's Leanna for scale. She is 6 feet tall. This thing is at least 21 feet in girth. Both of these trees would be relics of a past when the land they're grown in both cases. You guys tell me, was this open or forest based on the way this tree is grown? This one was open. Look, this is open. It's got big spreading branches. Actually, if Julie clicked back, I don't know if this is going to break the slideshow. This one too was also in the open. So there were some areas that were not solid forest here. It was mostly forest, but there were some basically oak openings where there was oak savanna, prairie vegetation. So anyway, you can go ahead, click ahead. So there are these open-grown oaks spread here and there throughout much of the Midwest. This was a tree that I personally are quite fond of. So here's me, here's my good friend Don. This is a tree back from Wisconsin. So I call them ghost oaks. These are basically the ghost of the land that was passed before it was changed so much. in the last 150, 200 years or so. So this tree is in new forest. This tree is in second growth forest, but it has these really broad spreading limbs that indicate that it once, when it was young, grew in a field. Southern Wisconsin, like parts here and there in northwest Ohio and the Darby Plains, southern Wisconsin was oak savanna. It was not dense forest. It was basically isolated oak trees in a matrix of like prairie and smaller vegetation. So this tree is a relic of a time when the land looked very different before white settlement. I called it the class of 1850 after Aldo Leopold. So I've struck out here basically on nobody heard of the Logan elm, nobody heard of the Logan oak except Dave. Anybody heard of Aldo Leopold though? All right, good. All right, yes, all right, good. So Aldo Leopold begins Sand County Almanac by talking about an old oak tree that's been struck by lightning and is being felled by a crosscut saw. And he talks about how many of the oaks in Wisconsin originated from basically the year after the last prairie fire, which was right around when Wisconsin became a state, around 1850. And so this, if you will, the class of 1850, sensu Leopold, would be there are many oaks that date from basically right after the last time the prairie burned, because a prairie fire, of course, would kill a small young oak tree. So they're in Ohio too. This one, now I scrambled to insert this photograph at the last minute, basically for Sarah's benefit, because this thing, here's a ghost oak right here. This is in Elm Creek State Park, so this thing's about 20 miles northeast of here. Unlike the ghost oak in Madison, girth of about 14 feet or so, this one, if you click, Julie, this one, the girth, I don't know, it's just burly. It's hard to tell. We've got this huge burl here. And so basically, I had to slip this photo in because this is just kind of entertaining. You can see me for scale. Basically, we have a lot of these trees, and I want you guys, when you know, the next time you're either walking in the woods or even just in a neighborhood in Columbus, keep your eye out for old oak trees. Keep an eye out for trees that have lost their lower limbs. So this one, even though it's in a second growth forest, its lower limbs are dying, or now actually long dead. That one, that one, that one, perhaps even some of these. So we can see that this tree in the past had a bunch of lower limbs. So what does that mean? It's open grown, right? So yeah, Grace, you remember this tree. So basically, I call them ghost oaks because this is a ghost of the forest past that was right here. And if you learn to recognize them, it will remind you of what this land once looked like. So click again for me, Julie. This one's probably a little younger than the one in Wisconsin. It's warmer down here in Ohio. Growth conditions are a little better. It's about the same size though, so maybe class of 1870. There's some embedded right in the city. So this one is right in the middle of Clintonville. There's a house on one side of it. There's a house on the other side of it. This thing, they divided two city lots basically between two houses to make sure that this tree would not be cut down when they built these houses. So basically the neighborhood was built around this tree a century ago, immediately post World War I. This thing is 14 feet 10 inches in girth. Julie, click for me. All right, here's another ash tree. So I wanted to talk about not just oaks, but other kinds of trees too. And clearly you can see I'm kind of striking out on the technical difficulties here, both with the clicker and also whatever was going on with that slide. So just get rid of that slide. Ash trees can also live a long time. I had to mention the chestnut blight at the beginning and talk about then Dutch elm disease. So we are living through the third pandemic for trees in the past century. We're living through a once-in-a-century pandemic for people, but we're living through the third pandemic in a century for trees. So this is for ash trees, the emerald ash borer. Who's heard of the emerald ash borer? Good. So the emerald ash borer is killing ash trees across the entire eastern US. This one was introduced again by accident, just like Dutch elm disease, just like the chestnut blight. This one was basically ash borers accidentally in shipping pallet wood that was delivered to Detroit around the turn of the last century, around 2000-ish. And so this is a beetle this time. There's no fungus that goes with it, it's just the beetle. But this beetle in this case, not from Europe, from Asia, this beetle kills ash trees, all native species of ash. Blue ash seem to be a little more resistant. Green ash and white ash seem to be very not resistant. So anyway, so here's an ash in Illinois. Here's me for scale. There won't be an ash tree of this size again, not only in our lifetimes when we're old. If you have children, there won't be an ash of this size in your children's lifetime when they're old. So it's really all I can say about that. There's one on campus here too. So this one is on the OSU campus. Yeah, my pointer's about to die also. All right, I'm gonna switch over to the other pointer. Yeah, there we go. All right, there we go. A lot better. So this one's on the OSU campus. So for those of you who are OSU students, go check this one out. This one is between 17th and 18th Avenue next to the SEL library. Click for me, Julie. So they're dying. This one is nearly dead. Click again. And here it is dead. So click again for me one more time. So I want to talk about sycamores next. I've talked about ash. So sycamores get even bigger than ash trees. So this is not in Ohio. I'm going to talk about the ones in Ohio in a moment. So this one is in Connecticut. This is the Gifford Pinchot sycamore in Connecticut here. This thing is 28 feet in girth. The ones in Ohio, there's one farther north of here that's quite big. There's one close to here that's almost as big. And go ahead, click for me. Yeah, so this is the one, this is in Ashland County. This is between Worcester and Mansfield. This thing, click for me again. I think we'll have a picture of people in it. No, the slides are messed up, we won't. We'll have a picture of people with this one though. So this one is in High Banks Metro Park. And there's at least one person in the audience here who's seen this tree with me. It's in an undisclosed location. I won't say exactly where it is. But this is one of the largest sycamores I know of. This one is in High Banks Metro Park, just north of Columbus. Here we are for scale, about 25 feet in girth. So Leanna and I both about 26 feet tall. Click. And this is supposed to be a photo of a sycamore on campus, not a photo of a big sycamore up on the Olentangy River that I'm climbing in. What I wanted to talk about is just like with the elms, when I mentioned the Neenah treaty elm in Wisconsin that had been cut down kind of foolishly before the other elms were dying of Dutch elm disease, there are old sycamores, basically from before this was city, before this was farm fields, that are also being cut down. On the south oval of the OSU campus, there are two large sycamores that remain from when that was Neil Run, which was a surface stream that's now channelized into a storm sewer. Mirror Lake is kind of all that remains of Neil Run. And the other thing that all that remains of Neil Run are the sycamores that grew along it. There was one by what is now the OSU Student Union. That one was cut down in 2007 for the building of that green union. Two are on the South Oval, and two were along when they were building John Herrick Drive. And so that's what the caption on the next slide was supposed to say, if the slides weren't messed up. Go ahead, click for me. And then there was another one. The last vestige of the original campus woods on the OSU campus. So this was by the corner of High and Woodruff. This was where the original football field was before they built the shoe in the 20s. The original football field was there, and part of the original campus woods was cleared for the first football field. Part of it remained, and it was behind Arps Hall. And this was cut down in, go ahead, click. This was cut down for an expansion of the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2019. And the one I mentioned before, cut down for the Union, was cut down in 2007. So the point is that there are trees that we lose to disease. There are other trees that we lose basically because we don't appreciate them. And if there's something that you guys remember tonight, that's what I'd like you to remember, is value the old trees that are there. Because you don't know if they're going to die of something, a new invasive pathogen, in the next decade, or blow down in a windstorm. So don't take them for granted. Don't cut them down for silly reasons like you just want to expand a parking lot.